had a thing. It was the Drew Carey Project. There wasn't a title. It was the Drew Carey Project, and it happened during the week of the LA riots. And I got fired. Was better. I got fired from the Drew Carey Project.
For 9 seasons, The Drew Carey Show was among the most-watched sitcoms on American television, at one point ranking within the top 15 programs nationwide. By the end of its run, Drew Carey was earning $750,000 per episode, reflecting just how valuable he was to the network. Then, almost suddenly, the show disappeared. It wasn't given a proper send-off. Episodes were burned off in the summer, aired out of order, and placed in undesirable time slots, as if the network wanted to move on quickly. The journey from peak success to quiet exit involves network politics, the rise of reality TV, a massive 233-episode contract that became restrictive, and personal struggles Carey faced behind the scenes. The ending that didn't match the show it replaced. The way The Drew Carey Show ended tells you almost everything about why it ended. And the two things don't match at all. The series finale aired on September 8th, 2004. Just over 5 million people watched it. To put that in context, during the show's peak years in the late 90s, it was regularly pulling in audiences 3 to 4 times that size. It had ranked 14th in the Nielsen ratings during its 4th season. Now, in its final season, it wasn't even appearing in the top 100. The finale was titled, with apparent indifference, simply finale. No fanfare, no send-off special, no reunion of the full original cast to give the show the ending it deserved. The Washington Post, in 2003, had already described the series as dead but still twitching, a phrase that captured the institutional mood surrounding the show before its final season had even been commissioned. What most viewers didn't know was that by the time that finale aired, ABC had already tried to cancel the show outright and failed. The network had attempted to get out of its contract with Warner Brothers Television during the 8th season, when ratings had already fallen off a cliff. Warner Brothers wouldn't let them. So ABC finished the 8th season by airing its remaining episodes over the summer of 2003, a deliberate graveyard slot, and was then legally obligated to produce and air an entire 9th season. The cost of that obligation was staggering. Each episode of the final season cost approximately $3 million to produce, a figure that included Drew Carey's salary of $750,000 per episode. ABC was paying $3 million per episode for a show it didn't want, airing in a slot nobody was watching. For a season, it had tried to avoid making entirely. That financial reality alone tells you everything about how the relationship between the network and the show had deteriorated. The tension between the network and the production team in those final months was real and documented. Director Sam Simon described the situation in interviews after the show ended, noting that the new regime at ABC had no investment in the show's success. It had been greenlit by people who were no longer there. As he put it, it becomes an embarrassment to new executives when shows championed by their predecessors outperform their own picks. The creative team, freed from meaningful corporate oversight because nobody at the network cared enough to intervene, actually took some of their most experimental risks in the final season. They shot with single cameras. They built sets with 4 walls. They let storylines go to strange and unexpected places. Simon described the experience as strangely liberating. The complete absence of commercial pressure allowed creative decisions that the show's earlier, higher-stakes seasons would never have permitted. It was, in its own way, the most honest television the show ever made, and almost nobody watched it. But to understand how a show that was once a genuine cultural phenomenon arrived at that point, you have to go back to where it started and understand what made it work before understanding what made it stop. Cleveland, a character called Drew, and the show that shouldn't have happened. Most successful sitcoms are set in New York or Los Angeles. The Drew Carey Show was set in Cleveland. That was a deliberate choice, and it mattered more than most people realized. Drew Carey was born in Cleveland on May 23, 1958, and grew up there in a working-class household. His father, Lewis Carey, died when Drew was 8 years old. That loss shaped him in ways that would eventually show up in his comedy. A particular understanding of disappointment, of ordinary life not going the way you planned, of finding humor not in success, but in the daily grind of simply getting by. He struggled through his teens and early 20s, enlisting in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1980, working odd jobs, developing a stand-up act in Cleveland clubs, before eventually making his way to the national stage. Comedy for Carey was never an escape from his background. It was a direct expression of it. His Tonight Show debut in 1991 was the moment everything changed. Johnny Carson didn't just applaud the performance, he invited Carey to the couch, a signal of genuine approval that Carson reserved for a very specific tier of comedian. It launched a career that led, eventually, to a television development deal and a partnership with writer Bruce Helford, who had previously worked on Roseanne. Together, they developed the concept for what would become The Drew Carey Show. The pitch to ABC went through after a brief fight for creative control, an early sign that Carey was not going to be passive about the kind of show he wanted to make. The show premiered on September 13, 1995 on ABC. The premise was simple: a fictionalized version of Drew Carey, working in the human resources department of a Cleveland department store called Winfred Lauder, navigating life with his group of childhood friends. His co-workers included Mimi Bobeck, played by Kathy Kinney, a character originally written as a one-episode antagonist who became so popular she evolved into one of the show's defining figures, eventually marrying Drew's cross-dressing brother Steve and becoming as central to the show's identity as Carey himself. His boss was the sadistic, unpredictable Nigel Wick, played by Craig Ferguson in a performance that launched Ferguson toward his own major American television career. The ensemble, Ryan Stiles, Diedrich Bader, Krista Miller, built a chemistry that was genuinely difficult to manufacture and impossible to fake. Carey's salary in the first season was $60,000 per episode. By the midpoint of the show's run, he had renegotiated to $300,000. The show finished its first season 48th in the Nielsen ratings. Its second season jumped to 18th. By the fourth season, it was 14th. The trajectory looked like the beginning of something that could run for 15 or 20 years. A 2025 retrospective in Cleveland magazine noted that Carey had specifically chosen the city as a setting to represent the Midwest's particular brand of grit and dry humor, a deliberate effort to make a show that felt categorically different from the coastal template that dominated American sitcoms. That identity gave the show its most loyal audience and distinguished it in a landscape crowded with shows about people who were hipper, richer, and better looking than the people watching them. Carey had been clear from the beginning about what he wanted the show to represent. He was from Cleveland. His character was from Cleveland. The show was going to be about the Midwest, about people who weren't glamorous, about the comedy of ordinary life. In a television landscape dominated by New York apartments and Los Angeles beaches, it was a genuinely different proposition. And for several years, audiences responded to it exactly the way he had hoped. What the show actually was, and why it was harder to make than it looked. There is a version of The Drew Carey Show that gets remembered as a fairly conventional 90s sitcom. 4 cameras, a laugh track, workplace, and relationship comedy. That version is incomplete, and it significantly undersells what the show was actually attempting. From its earliest seasons, the show experimented with its own format in ways that were highly unusual for a network sitcom at that time. It did live episodes with improvised scenes. It did a full-scale musical episode, a Broadway-style production number involving cast members from Whose Line Is It Anyway?, years before musical episodes became a recognizable genre convention. It ran recurring segments called What's Wrong with This Episode?, in which deliberate continuity errors and mistakes were seeded throughout an episode, and viewers at home were invited to identify them. It broke the fourth wall. It used audience participation. It was also, notably, the first television show in history to simulcast an episode on the internet, a detail that places it years ahead of the curve and speaks directly to Carey's instinct that the medium around him was changing faster than his network understood. For a show that is sometimes dismissed as mainstream and forgettable, its technical and formal ambition was genuinely ahead of its time. Craig Ferguson's character Nigel Wick became, over the show's run, one of the more genuinely complex comic creations in 90s network television. Wick developed a cocaine addiction, played for dark comedy, that had a direct painful parallel to Ferguson's own real-life struggles with alcohol and addiction, which he has spoken about publicly in considerable detail. The character's arc was not entirely invented. Ferguson has spoken in subsequent years about having been in the grip of serious addiction during his early years in America, and about how close he came to losing everything before getting sober. The fact that this was being dramatized, even obliquely, even in the context of a broad workplace comedy, in a network sitcom that millions of families watched on Wednesday nights, is more remarkable than the show has ever received credit for. It gave the series a layer of genuine darkness beneath its cheerful surface that distinguished it from its contemporaries. Carey himself was simultaneously running The Drew Carey Show and hosting the American version of Whose Line Is It Anyway?, which premiered on ABC in August 1998. That combination, a scripted sitcom and a live improv show, both on the same network, both carrying his name, was an unusual double act that pushed him onto the Forbes highest-paid entertainers list in 1998, with earnings of $45.5 million for that year. He was 24th on that list, alongside names that had spent decades building toward that kind of income. The pressure of maintaining both shows simultaneously, while managing the creative demands of each, was a workload that most people in his position would have found unsustainable. In his autobiography, Carey was candid about one persistent frustration during those years: censors. His stand-up comedy was off-color, direct, built on the kind of humor that had always been part of his voice. The network sitcom format required constant negotiation with standards and practices, and Carey found that friction genuinely limiting. The show that aired was always a more constrained version of the show he wanted to make. That gap between intention and execution mattered to him, and it shaped how he felt about the show's later years when both creative and commercial conditions deteriorated simultaneously. The moment the ratings fell, and what was actually happening around it. The decline of The Drew Carey Show's ratings is sometimes told as a simple story. The audience got bored, the show got worse, it ended. The reality was more specific than that, and several of the forces involved had nothing to do with the quality of the show itself. The show's fifth season, in 1999 to 2000, was the first time it fell out of the top 20. The ratings were still respectable, the show placed 24th, but the direction of travel was clear. By the sixth season, it had slid further. By the seventh, it had experienced a dramatic ratings drop that affected several ABC shows simultaneously, suggesting the issue was as much about the network's overall performance as it was about any individual program. The eighth season move to Monday nights, where the show competed directly with Monday Night Football, was a scheduling decision that accelerated what might otherwise have been a gradual decline into a rapid collapse. The show fell out of the top 100 entirely. Placing a sitcom opposite one of the most watched sports programs in America is not a neutral scheduling choice. It is a decision that almost guarantees failure, and it is difficult to read it as anything other than intentional. What was happening in the broader television landscape during this period is essential context. 2001 was the year Survivor broke through as a mainstream phenomenon. American Idol launched in 2002 and immediately became one of the highest-rated programs on television. Reality television wasn't just a new genre, it was a structural disruption to the entire economics of scripted network comedy. Reality shows cost a fraction of what a 9-season sitcom with a high-profile star costs to produce. They generated comparable or better ratings. They didn't require writers, complex production schedules, or star salaries that escalated season by season. And they were immune to the specific kind of audience fatigue that affects long-running scripted shows whose central premise has been largely exhausted. The Drew Carey Show was caught in that transition at exactly the wrong moment. It was in its later seasons, the period when a show's production costs are at their highest and its creative energy is most likely to be depleted, precisely when reality television was demonstrating that the network could reach large audiences for a fraction of the cost. The institutional logic of keeping a $3 million per episode show on the air became very difficult to defend in boardroom conversations, where the alternative was a reality format that could be produced for a tenth of that figure and generate equivalent viewership. There was also a specific internal dynamic that deserves mention. The executive team at ABC that had greenlit and championed The Drew Carey Show had, by the show's final seasons, been replaced entirely. New leadership had no personal investment in the show's success and no institutional memory of why it had mattered. Sam Simon's observation about this, that it becomes embarrassing for new regimes when inherited shows outperform their own selections, captures something real about how television networks actually function. The Drew Carey Show wasn't just competing with other shows in the ratings. It was competing with the career interests of executives who would have preferred it to fail quietly and be replaced by something they could claim credit for. A contract that trapped everyone, and what the final season really was. The specifics of how the show's final 2 seasons played out reveal something that rarely gets discussed openly about how network television actually works, and it is considerably more dysfunctional than most viewers imagine. When ABC tried to cancel the show after the 8th season and discovered they couldn't break the contract with Warner Brothers Television, the result was a 9th season that both parties approached with barely concealed indifference. ABC scheduled it for summer 2004, a deliberate burial. Summer is traditionally when networks air content they don't believe in, because reduced viewership means reduced embarrassment. The episodes aired partially out of order. There was no promotional campaign of any significance. The show that had once been marketed as a flagship ABC comedy was being disposed of with minimum effort and maximum quiet. What makes this particularly striking is that the people who had built the show, the writers, the cast, the directors, were still showing up every day to make something they cared about, inside a machine that had entirely stopped caring whether it was good. The final season's finale drew just over 5 million viewers, a number that, in a different context, would represent a modest but respectable audience for a summer burn-off. In the context of a show that had once drawn 15 to 20 million viewers at its peak, it was a statement about how completely the relationship between the show and its network had broken down. 5 million people watching a finale they hadn't been reminded existed, airing in a slot designed to minimize attention, represents a kind of institutional abandonment that is unusual even by the unsentimental standards of the television industry. What makes the story more complicated is that the final season, freed from network scrutiny precisely because nobody cared about it anymore, actually contains some of the show's most formally interesting work. The decision to switch to single-camera shooting, a technique gaining ground in prestige, shows like The Office in the UK, gave certain episodes a completely different visual texture. The 4-wall set construction created a spatial coherence the traditional sitcom format had never allowed. The writers took narrative risks they would not have been permitted in seasons where commercial outcomes were being closely monitored. It was, paradoxically, some of the most creatively adventurous television the show ever produced. None of that translated into better ratings because the ratings infrastructure had already collapsed entirely. But it suggests that the show's creative team was not simply marking time. They were making something genuine, even at the end, even in circumstances designed to ensure nobody watched. Drew Carey's own public statements about the cancellation have been consistently measured. He has spoken about it as an outcome driven by rising costs and declining ratings, an honest assessment that doesn't fully capture the network politics, but isn't wrong either. In a 2025 Parade magazine interview, he described the show's humor as timeless, while acknowledging the run had derailed in its later stages. The word derailed does quiet but significant work in that sentence. It implies an external force that knocked the show off a path it was otherwise still on, rather than a natural conclusion to a story that had run its course. That distinction matters enormously, both to Carey and to anyone trying to understand what actually happened. The life Drew Carey was living while all this was happening. The story of why The Drew Carey Show ended is not only a story about ratings and network contracts. It is also, at least partly, a story about who Drew Carey was when he was making it, and what he was carrying that the cameras never showed. His father died when he was 8 years old. That is not a piece of background detail that washes away in adulthood. It is the kind of early loss that shapes a person's relationship with stability, with success, with the constant background fear of things disappearing. Carey has spoken in interviews about attempting self-harm twice, during his teens and 20s, on both occasions using sleeping pills. He was, by his own account, deeply depressed during periods of his life that coincided with the show's most commercially successful years. The public face, the round glasses, the buzz cut, the cheerful, working-class everyman absorbing absurdity with a shrug was not the complete picture of who was showing up to the set each morning. The gap between the character he played and the person playing him was wider than anyone watching from the outside could have known. He has spoken about how comedy functioned for him not as a performance of happiness, but as a mechanism for processing difficulty. The stand-up tradition he came from, direct, self-deprecating, built on the comedy of failure and embarrassment, was connected to something genuinely real in his own experience. He was not performing a character who was unlike him. He was performing a version of himself that the cameras were allowed to see, edited for broadcast. The parts that didn't fit the format stayed off-screen. During the show's run, he was also navigating the pressure of being one of the most commercially valuable entertainers in American television, while simultaneously managing a creative vision that was in constant friction with the network's institutional priorities. The censorship battles, the scheduling decisions he had no control over, the growing sense, in the final seasons, of watching something he had built being handled carelessly by people who hadn't built it and didn't particularly value it. What Carey has never done publicly is position himself as a victim of that process. His statements about the show's end have been consistently measured and fair-minded. But the subtext, that a show he cared about was managed toward failure by people with no stake in its survival, is not difficult to read between the lines of those careful, composed assessments. His personal life during and after the show carried its own weight. In 2018, he became engaged to Amy Harwick, a therapist and writer he had met in 2017 at a Hollywood party where she was working as a bartender. He introduced her publicly on a Valentine's Day episode of The Price is Right. The engagement ended later that year. In February 2020, Harwick was killed in her Hollywood Hills apartment by a former boyfriend who broke in, strangled her, and threw her from the third-floor balcony. The day before she was killed, she had sent Carey a text message saying she had been thinking about forgiveness and wanted to talk. He replied that he loved her and that he would see her the following week. She was dead before that meeting could happen. Carey has described the aftermath of her death publicly and with unusual candor. He said it destroyed him. He said he still thinks about her every day. He said he no longer pursues romantic relationships, that Harwick's death damaged his capacity for intimacy in ways he has not been able to fully repair. These are not the kinds of statements a person makes lightly, and they reframe the image of Drew Carey that the show created. The genial, resilient everyman who absorbs absurdity and bounces back, as a partial and carefully managed portrait of a considerably more complicated person. Where Drew Carey actually ended up, and what the show turned out to mean. In 2007, 3 years after The Drew Carey Show aired its final episode, Drew Carey replaced Bob Barker as the host of The Price is Right. It was a transition that a significant portion of the viewing public approached with genuine skepticism. Barker had hosted the show for 35 years. He had become so identified with the program that the idea of anyone else standing behind that podium seemed almost structurally impossible. Carey was aware of that skepticism and addressed it directly and without defensiveness. He was not trying to replace Barker, he said, and comparisons were beside the point. He was going to do his own version of the job in his own way and let the audience decide whether it worked. That directness, no ego, no posturing, no manufactured enthusiasm, was exactly what The Price is Right needed from a new host, and it is almost certainly why the transition succeeded where many expected it to fail. 17 years later, he is still doing it. He celebrated the show's 10,000th episode in February 2025. He has maintained the ratings that Barker built without alienating the audience that Barker accumulated over 3.5 decades. He continued Barker's tradition of signing off each episode by encouraging viewers to have their pets spayed and neutered. The transition, which looked from the outside like a significant risk for all parties, turned out to be one of the most durable and quietly successful casting decisions in American game show history. Nobody talks about it as a risk anymore, because the outcome was so settled and so complete. The Drew Carey Show, meanwhile, went into syndication in September 1999, before it had even ended its original run. and continued airing in various forms for years. In August 2024, all 9 seasons became available to stream for free on Plex. The show's 30th anniversary was marked in September 2025. It is, in the language of contemporary media, a genuine catalog title, something people discover independently, revisit with genuine affection, and recommend to others outside of its original cultural moment. The fact that it found a new streaming home 3 decades after its premiere and that the anniversary generated real coverage and real conversation suggests an audience that never fully went away and a show that holds up considerably better than the circumstances of its cancellation might lead anyone to expect. What the show actually was, assessed now with the distance of 2 decades, is something worth stating plainly. It was a network sitcom that took the post-Seinfeld model of the comedian as lead and applied it to a genuinely different set of values. Working class rather than cosmopolitan, Midwestern rather than coastal, interested in ordinary failure rather than fashionable neurosis. It was formally adventurous in ways that weren't always legible at the time. It was genuinely funny for long stretches and genuinely inconsistent in others. It was the first television show to simulcast an episode on the internet. It gave Craig Ferguson and Ryan Stiles 2 of the most distinctive supporting roles in 90s comedy. It built an ensemble, Mimi, Wick, Lewis, Oswald, whose characters were individual enough to carry scenes and storylines independently of their star. The cancellation, assessed honestly, was not a single event with a single cause. It was the convergence of escalating production costs. A ratings decline accelerated by a reality television revolution that changed the entire economics of network programming. A network that had replaced the people who believed in the show with people who didn't. A scheduling decision in the 8th season that turned a difficult situation catastrophic, and a contract dispute that made the final season an obligation nobody wanted to honor. Drew Carey himself, the man whose name was on the building for 9 years, had relatively little control over most of those factors. What he did control, the creative intent, the casting, the choice to set the show in Cleveland, the determination to make it about something other than glamour, held up better than everything that surrounded it. And that, in the end, is probably the most honest summary available. A good show, caught in bad circumstances, managed by people who had stopped caring whether it survived. The Drew Carey Show peaked inside the top 15 programs in American television and ended with barely 5 million viewers watching a finale that its own network didn't bother to properly schedule. So the real question is whether the show failed or whether the system around it did. And if you were running a network in 2003, faced with a $3 million per episode sitcom and the rising cost efficiency of reality television, would you have made a different call? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.